You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, now let's go to understand other colonies. We'd covered Massachusetts and Virginia. Now let's go with the creation of Georgia. Native peoples are going to resist, again, British occupation wherever the British went. So in Georgia, they'll be known, in the Carolinas, they'll be known as the Westo Wars, the Tuscarora Wars, and the Yamasee Wars. The Westo Wars would create much death and destruction between 1680 to 1683 in Georgia. So Georgia has a tremendous history of genocidal intrusions. The Timucuas, the Guadlis, and the Apalaches resisted white intrusions. And just to the north of Georgia, the Tuscarora Wars would last between 1709 and 1713. The peoples there were known as the Coreys, Pamlicos, and Matamusquits. They would ally and go on an all-out front to stop the Carolinas from expanding. And in fact, after these wars, the Tuscarora will leave this area to the north and ask the Iroquois if they could join them. And this is how the Iroquois will go from 5 nations to 6 nations. And as the southern colonies expanded, the Yamasee Wars will keep expansion at bay between 1715 and 1717. Now, what's most important to appreciate is the 120 years resistance movements along this coastal region. Now, this particular map shares with you all of the designs that Europe has in terms of their land claims for their land claims against native peoples. So when we take a look at the Mississippian region, this region here, the native peoples in this region here are going to benefit from the 120 years resistance by the coastal societies. They will have a tremendous effect on the experiences of the interior nations here. If it hadn't been for the resistance efforts that I provided for you from Massachusetts all the way down to the Carolinas and Georgia, if it hadn't been for their efforts to keep the colonies at bay, the interior groups, especially the Cherokee, the Creek, the Cherokee in this region here, the Creek in this region here, and the Iroquois in this region here, will not be able to organize defense mechanisms by which to stop colonial settlers from moving into their area in this region here, in what is known as the Mississippi Valley and the Ohio Valley. This right here is the Appalachian Mountains, and colonial settler societies are going to begin to move into this region here. And so in the 18th century, and we're talking about the 1700s, the 18th century, the wars between the colonies and the native peoples will have imperial designs. The 18th century wars were the result of grand imperial strategies of the major powers. The French, this green area is the French, this yellow golden area the British, and the purple areas here are the Spanish. So the French, the British, and the Spanish are all vying for sovereignty or suzerainty over native lands. These wars between the French, the British, and the Spanish, these wars are for control of the Great Lakes region, one of the most lucrative areas, especially with regards to the fur trade. They were for control of the Ohio River, again, prime real estate, prime lands. In fact, this is what most people call the heartland of America. And if you ever go to the Ohio and understand the Ohio, you can see the beauty and the richness of the resources in this area. And this was an area that was going to be claimed by the French, the British, and the Spanish. And the Mississippi and the Gulf Coast. All of this region, everybody's vying for power. So without the coastal societies' resistance movements, the interior nations in this region here would not have been able to sustain a concerted resistance movement in the 1700s. Now, the native strategy was negotiation and a successful playing off of European rivals. So these groups in the center here were able to play the French, the British, and the Spanish off against each other. The coastal resistance movements, again, of the 17th century allowed the interior groups to maintain a high degree of political centralization and enable them to follow a policy of neutrality. The interior nations recognized that they posed a threat to one side or the other, depending on who was fighting amongst the Europeans, whether it be the French, the British, or the Spanish. So native peoples are going to join whichever side was to their advantage, and they were successful for the most part in the 18th century. However, for those who became incorporated into colonial society, they faced a life of exclusion, of segregation, and discrimination in the 18th century. And most importantly, those native peoples of the South were associated with violence. Now, one of the things that's most important to appreciate, and I'm going to share with you here in Florida, is a unique cultural expression that will arise in the 18th century that will challenge the colonization schemes of the British and the Spanish in the South, that areas will eventually become the states of Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And that is the creation of the Seminole Nation, which begins when Creeks expanding their influence into this region from Alabama and the Mississippi region into South Georgia and into Florida, are going to encounter runaway slaves, African slaves, and the survivors of the Western Wars, the Timucuas, the Gualis, and the Apalaches. They will continue the Timucua cultural traditions in the swamplands of Florida, and they will resist attempts to eliminate them, and they will create what the Spanish will call renegades. And the Spanish for renegade is Seminole. So the Seminole Nation is going to be created as a result of all of these colonial pressures for their land. The Seminoles survive to this day. So I'm going to be providing you some film clips as well as a documentary on this particular experience. So I'm going to ask you to go and watch those documentaries. And so this will end this particular session on the interior nations.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.